to actually chat with each other during the talk, that's fine too. But if you have questions for the speaker, please put them in the Q&A, and I'll moderate and get them to her. After an hour, we're going to invite just the mentees and mentors to stay and have a bit more of a conversation with the speaker today. So let me go ahead and introduce Dr. SAoumya Balasubramanya. She's a senior economist at the World Bank in their environment, natural resources, and blue economy global practice. She's primarily a microeconomist and does research on poverty, development, and equity, really thinking about issues at the nexus of water, agriculture, environment, energy, and health. So I'll let her talk rather than me doing more of an introduction, but we're really delighted to have you here, SAoumya.
Thanks, Cheryl. It's very nice to be here. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone who's online, wherever you are. I hope you're well and I hope you're safe. I'm going to talk today a little bit about my research and perhaps take a deep dive into how I think and conceptualize problems. And just want to say here before I start off that, of course, everything I'm going to say out here are my personal views and they're not the official position of the World Bank. And I'm really talking here in my capacity as a scientist and not necessarily as an employee of the bank. And I wanted to really talk about my research work and perhaps give you a few examples of how I think about research. And of course, there's no one way to think about it. This is just my way of thinking about it. And I'm going to talk about, and my the research that I do largely falls under this umbrella of environment and development economics. And I specifically conduct research for policy. So I try to make my research as rigorous as possible, but it is for the purposes of policy. So it's often motivated by a policy question and by trying to fix something on the ground. And I'm going to talk about the importance of learning from failure. And so what is environment and development first, just to unpack that. So when you think of environment and environmental issues, typically economists tend to think about it as market failures. And right, so you don't have property rights. We don't have prices for a lot of environmental amenities. And so the solution in neoclassical economics, at least, talks about internalizing externalities. So we often think of Gaussian solutions, which is about establishing property rights, or Pigouvian solutions, which is really about pollution taxes or subsidizing good behaviors, etc. Now, if you think about the literature of environmental economics, a lot of it originated in OECD countries, by which I mean Western Europe and North America. And so a lot of the solutions are perhaps better catered towards application in those contexts. But when we talk about development, which is really where we're talking about solving environmental problems in the presence of poverty, it's not very clear whether these solutions are entirely applicable. And if they can be applied, they're difficult to apply. And it's not quite clear whether the benefits of applying these would sort of exceed the costs and the transaction costs of putting them into place, because implementing things such as property rights or taxes or pollution taxes in a context of in India or a country in sub-Saharan Africa it's not a trivial question. And so I look at how do we solve. So I look at this nexus of issues between environment and development, and I conduct research at scale in order to provide evidence for decision-making and course correction in policy. And I like to think about failure, by which I mean I start the question by thinking about why does something not work? Because I often find that failure can be quite universal. Learning from failure has context in other, you learn from failure in one place and you can often transfer that lesson to other places a bit more easily than success, because success is very, very context specific. And so I'm going to sort of give you two examples of the work that I do. The first is going to be really talking about ways to reduce water use in agriculture in India. And I'm drawing from a bunch of published work here. So you can have a look at some of these papers which are already out there. And now I'm going to give an example from sub-Saharan Africa about where there's a desire to increase irrigation in the face of climate change. and talk a little bit about why progress may perhaps have been slower than what people would have liked. So in a sense, it's an interesting contrast, because in South Asia, there's a lot of water that's used in agriculture, and the challenge is really how do you rationalize it, and it's not easy to do. While in sub-Saharan Africa, there is every policy as well as scientific reason to expand the use of water, particularly groundwater, where it is available for irrigation in Africa, and yet where things have been tried and there's been more of an effort to do so, progress has been slow. And so we'll kind of look at why both of those problems are challenging. So very quickly, for those of you who may not know a lot about India, this particular study is based in the Punjab, which is really the breadbasket of India. All cultivated, almost all land is cultivated. It's a paddy wheat system. So there's paddy in the monsoon and wheat in the winter, and all cultivated land is also irrigated. And almost the greatest volume of water used for irrigation is through groundwater. And almost all tube wells, which are the gadgets that pump water out of the ground, run on electricity. This electricity has been provided free of charge historically. And in a way, it is these huge subsidies driven by the state that contributed to the Green Revolution in India. So, the heavy subsidization of agriculture, including inputs, including energy, including water, has certainly had some benefits, but it's also come at a cost, which is the groundwater levels are, of course, rapidly falling. Withdrawals are significantly greater than recharge. And this is very likely a resource that is sort of being drawn down. And the drawdown has, of course, produced benefits in terms of incomes, food security, etc. So there's a cost. It's also important to note that because electricity has been provided free of charge, 61% of the government of Punjab's fiscal deficit is due to electricity subsidies. So it's a massive burden on the fiscal deficit of the state, and ultimately on the exchequer as well, right? And of course, because there has been a history of not pricing electricity, water, or putting a cap on the volume of water that can be extracted for wells, or in restricting where and how boreholes and wells are installed and drilled. Introducing these now it's not a very practical solution, let's put it that way. And because a lot of policy is not Markovian, history matters. So if there's been a history of doing something, it's very hard to kind of change that and kind of go there. And what's happened typically in the Punjab is the utilities that provide this electricity free of charge to governments provide it on a schedule. So they rotate the hours of electricity between farmers so that, farmers on different agricultural lines get electricity only for about 8 hours. And usually, the voltage, the quality of the electricity that's provided is fairly poor in order to quote unquote, restrict the ability of farmers to draw out water. And so, of course, as you can imagine, human beings are innovative. You try to put these restrictions in, people try to get around them, and that's pretty much what has happened, because farmers don't know when the electricity will be available in their agricultural line, and nobody wants to go out in the middle of the night to try and turn on the pump. And of course, people have other things to do. So almost every pump has a small device attached to it called an auto starter. So the moment the device detects that there is electricity in the line, it just turns the pump on, and the pump keeps on pumping irrespective of whether irrigation is needed or not. And so that's one. So there's been a measure to try and restrict the use of electricity. People get around that. The other thing that was, of course, done was to delay the transplantation of rice. So the rice transplantation date is announced every year, according to when the monsoons begins in order to lower the pressure on extracting groundwater. But because of climate change, because of the fact that rainfall patterns are changing, the monsoon seems to be starting later every year, as a result of which the harvest of rice is also later, and farmers typically end up burning the stubble because they don't have really time to clean the land before they can plant the wheat rice. So again, trying to sort of get people to extract less groundwater by timing the transplantation of rice to the monsoon may have inadvertently increased air pollution issues around in Punjab, which is sort of that area of Punjab, Haryana, etc. is really a very pollution intensive place to live in, especially in the winters. And so since all of these textbook solutions on prices and quantities and restrictions cannot really be implemented, so the question that policymakers have been debating is, well, if we can't do all of this stuff, can we award positive behaviors? So if we can't use the sticks, can we use carrots instead? And so one of the ways to do that is to think about assigning electricity entitlements. So every farmer gets an entitlement of electricity, and if they don't use their entire entitlement, the utility purchases it back. And the reason why this is attractive is, of course, because if the farmer were to use that marginal unit of electricity, it costs the utility much more to supply it than to just buy an unused unit back. So it sort of, the utility still makes losses, but you reduce the magnitude of losses. So that's primarily the motivation behind this. And the hope is that, because farmers would sell some of these units back, perhaps pumping falls, but it's very hard to measure pumping directly because there are no water meters anywhere. And so the question is, does this sort of assigning electricity entitlements and buying back unused units, does it work or not? And this has been tried in 2 states in India. So one is Punjab, which is where the study is from. That's the Mitra et al. Paper. And the other one is in Gujarat, which is the Fishman et al. Paper. And I want to say right now that the Gujarat example actually does not find any changes in pumping behavior, while the study in Punjab, that's our study, does. But we know why we have those differences, and we'll go into why we find these different results and why it's important to think about the context of success and how transferable that success actually is. So we'll go into that in a bit. So this is kind of, for those of you who don't know, this is Punjab. This is sort of what the state looks like. As you can see, it's a very groundwater heavy state. There is, and this map essentially shows you the depth to groundwater level. So in a lot of cases, groundwater is fairly deep, and those depths have increased over time. And this was a pilot study which was actually implemented in a few feeders in Punjab, and the feeder selection, of course, was not random, and it was primarily linked to the ease of piloting. However, the selection of the feeders on which this pilot would be tried is not linked to transmission and distribution losses, simply because even utilities don't know how high T&D losses are, because there is a lack of metering, at the farm level. There are no meters at the farm level. So this is sort of what the scheme looks like. You have 6 pilot feeders where they essentially, the government essentially, instead of keeping the schedule of electricity variables, said that they would be farmers or clients on those 6 pilot feeders would be provided 8 hours of daytime electricity. And then on those pilot feeders, farmers were given an option to enroll into this cash incentive. And if they were, then they were given an entitlement of electricity. If the farmers who enrolled into the cash incentive exceeded their entitlement, there is no penalty for it. But if they use less than their entitlement, then the utility would purchase it back and reward them for not using their entire entitlement. And so what we have in the study design is essentially we have treatment at the feeder level. which is there's a pilot feeder and a feeder with business as usual. So the feeder with business as usual is one where farmers do not know when they're going to get the electricity. And of course, they don't have the opportunity to enroll into this cash incentive scheme. And then there's a treatment at the feeder level. And then there's a treatment at the farm level where, of course, there is selection into the treatment. Farmers have to decide whether they enroll into the cash incentive or not. And so you end up having three groups, sort of G1, which are sort of enrolled farmers and pilot feeders who get the 8 hours of daytime electricity, plus a rebate on any electricity saved, that is any entitlement that they don't use. Then you have non-enrolled farmers in pilot feeders who only get the 8 hours of electricity. And then you have sort of business as usual farmers and business as usual feeders, which means they're receiving intermittent electricity supply on a rotation schedule, and they have no option to, of course, enroll into the cash scheme. And so we do two levels of analysis. We do a feeder level analysis with secondary data because there are meters at the feeder level. So the utility knows what electricity consumption looks like on a monthly basis at the feeder level. We don't know what that looks like at the farm level or at the level of the client, actually, because those meters are not there. And then at the farmer level, we do an analysis based on pumping hours. And we'll go into that as well. And so we do two things. We sort of compare self-reported pumping hours for paddy in 2019 across these different groups of farmers. We use an instrumental variable strategy as well as a matching, as well as a PSM strategy as well. And at the feeder level, we get monthly electricity consumption data historically from the utility. And we are able to look at electricity consumption and how that varies over time. And we use a synthetic controls analysis to do that. And why do we do that? It's because so if you are a farmer in the G1 category, that means you're a farmer on a pilot feeder and you're supposed to be enrolled into the cash incentive, you get metered. However, if you are on a pilot feeder and choose not to enroll into the cash incentive, you don't get metered. And of course, if you're on a farmer on a business as usual feature, then there's never been a meter. So we can't just rely on the metering because we only have the meter readings for only one of the three groups. And that's the reason why we go to the secondary data as well, in order to verify our results from the farm level. And so this is sort of what the sample looks like. As you can see, the sample is divided between two districts. There are six feeders, three of them treatment, three of them control. We essentially pretty much got everybody who was enrolled into, so for those in the G1 category, we pretty much surveyed everybody who had enrolled in the pilot. So we ended up surveying the population of farmers who decided to enroll. And for the G2 and the G3, we enumerated those who fit into the G2 and the G3 category and randomly took a draw of a maximum of, I can't even remember what the numbers are, something like, I think up to 50 farmers in a feeder or something like that. So essentially we are powered to test for these differences. And that's the total sample size of 383 farmers. At the farm level, the survey examines pumping hours, because remember, meters are only there for those, for farmers who chose to opt into the cash incentive strategy. Nobody else has a meter at the farm level. So at the farm level, we look at self-reported pumping hours, which of course which we know self-reported data often comes with recall issues, measurement error associated with those recall issues, etc. We look at the effect of the cash incentive by comparing, enrolled farmers on pilot feeders and non-enrolled farmers on pilot feeders. So that's G1 and G2. We look at the effect of uninterrupted daytime electricity, which is just the effect of having 8 hours of uninterrupted daytime electricity. And we do that by comparing non-enrolled farmers on pilot feeders with business as usual farmers. And then we look at the effect of the entire treatment, which is both the daytime electricity and the cash incentive. And that we get by looking at the enrolled farmers on the pilot feeder versus the business as usual farmers. Everybody enrolled here is an owner of land, not a tenant. We'll go into why that's tenancy is a bit of a problem later on. And we implemented the survey in November and December 2019, where we elicited data on the monsoon paddy crop that had just been harvested, as well as the previous wheat crop, which would have been harvested in April or May of that year. And we asked farmers so for those who enrolled into the cash incentive program, we asked them to report behaviors on the largest plot that's irrigated by the enrolled pump. And for the other two groups, the largest plot irrigated by their electric pump. So we're getting data on the largest plot out there. We validated self-reported hours with electricity consumption data for just the G1 group to check if there is any underreporting, but that's the only group we can validate it for because they're the only group with, I mean, if you have to enroll into the cash incentive program, then you have to be metered, or else how do we know how much you used against your entitlement? So we can't do that for the other two groups. And of course, as you can imagine, when you look at the effect of the cash incentive program itself, enrollment in the cash incentive program is not random. And so we instrument for it using essentially, and we were lucky that we were able to find an instrument for this. And the instrument is essentially whether the farmer who enrolled in needed to update their name in the consumer in the consumer records that are maintained by the electricity. So because electricity has always been free and there are no meters at the farm level, no bills have ever been presented to farmers. So consequently, there is no updating of consumer names. And what this means is that since land is historically inherited along the paternal line, where males who are working the land today inherited from their fathers and their grandfathers, the pump is often in the name of the father or the grandfather who has, well, deceased. So, and this was important. The reason why this updating was needed to be done was because if the farmer who enrolled ended up not using his entire quota of electricity and needed and so the utility would reward that behavior, that's done through a bank transfer, an electronic bank transfer. It's not given as cash in hand. And in order to do that, the name on the consumer records has to match the name on the bank account. So if we look at who required updating and who didn't, 78% of people who did not need to update their consumer name with the utility enrolled, and only 12% who required updating enrolled. So there is a correlation between enrolling and not requiring to update your name, so to speak. So pre-treatment differences in farm, plot, household characteristics are similar between those who needed updating and those who did not. The only difference between those two groups is the age of the head of the household. And that's just related to the fact of, you've inherited the land from, your ancestors and they have deceased. And 92% of those who needed updating needed so because of the death of the original consumer. And so in a sense, the instrument is almost random, right? We don't control when we are born and we don't control when we die. So, and then we check for a whole bunch of assumptions that the instrument has to follow, which is about monotonicity, checking that the probability of enrollment and irrigation behaviors are not affected by each other. We're testing for exclusion restrictions. We're testing for adequacy using a bunch of generated instruments. And so we do a whole bunch of checks in order to make sure that the instrument is appropriate for use and it satisfies those. But the first question is who enrolls? So we just do a very simple regression, on the probability of enrollment, etc. And so if you have a bigger pump, which is really the capacity of the pump is measured by horsepowers. So one greater horsepower reduces the probability of enrollment by 1.4 percentage points. one more pump increases the enrollment by 17%, and older farmers are more likely to enroll. So basically, those who are enrolling are those who probably have more than one pump. So they're enrolling one pump into the scheme, and then they're keeping the other pump as business as usual. So that introduces the possibility of leakage. And we check for that as well, which is where the secondary level data helps. And we also look at, and of course, if you are a larger pump, that means you have a larger land holding. So people with larger land holdings are slightly less likely to enroll. That's kind of what this is telling us. So we look at the effect of the cash incentive scheme. We run a simple OLS, then we do a two-stage least square, where the first stage is linear, and then we sort of, do a bunch of IVs where we have the generated plus the external instruments, etc. And so essentially what we see is the effect of the cash incentive scheme does reduce the self-reported hours of pumping for all farmers, as well as, when we look at only the behaviors of those who cultivated paddy in the 2019 monsoon season. And I do want to check out here that these are late. So these are latent average treatment effects. They are under so the confidence intervals on these are fairly wide. I do want to point that out, and that's because of there's heterogeneous treatment effects going on here. We don't go into exploring that heterogeneity, but we acknowledge that it's there. We look at different sets of dependent variables. So we look at pumping hours per day. We look at number of days since enrollment. We look at paddy yields. We look at different subsamples, and we also test recall, right? So we compare the self-reported hours of pumping of the group that got metered because they enrolled into the program with their bills, which will actually show the number of units, and then we use a conversion to see whether the self-reported hours, when we use a formula that we know what the self-reported hours of pumping are, we know what the horsepower of their pump is. So if we were to use that to generate what this means in terms of units used, does that actually compare to the units that the bill is saying that the farmer used? And we find that that's more or less the case. So at least for the group that got enrolled, recall error on self-reported hours of pumping is not too bad. We hope it's the same for the others, but we have no way of really testing that. Then we look at the effect of the daytime electricity supply itself, and then the net effect of the daytime electricity and the cash incentive. We use a nearest neighbor match in this particular case because we don't have an instrument here. So we look at the Mahalanobis distance metric, and we're estimating the average treatment effect of enrollment, and we're also estimating the average treatment effect for daytime electricity here. And so we look at a bunch of, we match on a whole set of characteristics that you can see out here, and this is a bias corrected estimator. And then what we find here is, of course, that the cash incentive plus the daytime electricity produces a reduction in self-reported hours of pumping. Daytime electricity alone does not. And so it's really that net effect of having, I know when my electricity is coming, plus if I don't use all of my quota, I can earn something, is what's driving this behavior. And then we sort of verify these results by looking at feeder level analysis. Because like I said, we don't have metered data for everybody at the farm level. So we look at the feeders where we have the pilot feeders and the control feeders, and we were able to get 41 months worth of electricity consumption data. So this is data at the feeder level of the electricity consumed on that line between January 2015 all the way up to December 2019. And we divide it into two periods, a pre-intervention and a post-intervention period. We do this for 5 of the 6 feeders because the last feeder, the agriculture, typically in almost most of Punjab, feeder lines are separated for agricultural and non-agricultural use, but in Dhanoya, that separation was not complete. And so that's the reason why we kind of dropped that here. Or else we'd be picking up the effects of other consumption on that line. And of course, when you're at the feeder, everybody's behavior is being tracked. What that means is, so if you're an enrolled farmer on a pilot feeder and you have 2 pumps and one pump is enrolled into the scheme while the other is not, it doesn't matter because everybody's consumption is being recorded. Every pump's consumption on that feeder is being recorded. Group for each treatment feeder by solving for a set of weights, essentially. The weighted average of every controlled feeder is similar to one treatment feeder. And that's philosophically what you're trying to do. And there's a whole bunch of variables that you have to use in order to construct those variables. These are the ones that we use. And then you sort of train, you sort of have a train. And so the way to do this is you take a bunch of data and you sort of construct those weights for a training period. And then you use the same weights on a validation period, so that's sort of the way this is done. So we do that. And this is what we find. So if you look at when the intervention was put into place, which is this red line, what you find is fairly parallel lines pre-trend between the treatment and the control feeders, and then they differ after the intervention. And we look at both yearly electricity consumption as well as electricity consumption between the months of June and October, because that's when the peak irrigation period is, because that's when the paddy is being cultivated, and paddy in the monsoons is irrigated in Punjab. It's not just rain-fed. And that's where the majority of water is really drawn out. And so we see that it's similar. You have parallel trends pre-intervention. And then, of course, post-intervention, you find that there is this fall in electricity consumption at the feeder level for the pilot feeders as compared to the synthetic control feeders. And we run and so there's up to a 25 to 27% reduction in electricity consumption. We do a whole bunch of robustness checks using the data itself. And we also check if better electricity to the pilot feeders just, might make electricity supplies to the control feeders worse. That's not the case. So we look at a bunch of things to make sure that that's the case. So thinking about why is this attractive? This is attractive because it is producing, at least in the pilot case, it is producing significant reductions in pumping hours and electricity consumption. Even the smallest reduction is sort of at being the most conservative is still about 7.5%, probably really more in the realm of 25 to 26% reduction in pumping hours and electricity consumption, which is huge, right? And this is really important because, like I said, the utilities go bankrupt providing electricity subsidies in perpetuity to farmers. So in a sense, this reduction in pumping has the potential to reduce the subsidy burden of the electricity of the utility. That's the attractive feature out here. And why is this reduction achieved? It is achieved because in the pilot case, those who enroll know when their electricity is coming, they know it's in the daytime, and so they just stop using these auto starters. So essentially, the pump doesn't run unless it needs to run. So the wastage is really being reduced. That's what's happening out here. And like I said, it's attractive because it's more expensive for the utility if the farmer used up their entire quota than if the utility buys back, the quota that the farmer does not use. So even if you were to assume a 10% reduction in electricity consumption, that's a reduction of about $26 million in subsidies. So it's extremely attractive for the government in terms of just reducing the fiscal burden. But why should we be cautious about thinking about scaling this up? The problem is everybody cannot be provided uninterrupted electricity in the daytime. Somebody is going to have to receive electricity at night. So then when you scale this up, it's not really clear what these results would look like, because for those who and then when we debriefed with farmers, and we were talking about what if you had the option to enroll into the same cash incentive scheme, but you have electricity in the night, most people will tell you, I don't want to be bothered coming out at night. I'm going to continue using my auto starter. So the thing is, so that's one problem. The second problem is tenancy. There's a lot of tenancy in Punjab. And because the pump name has to, the name, the bank account and the name of the consumer has to match. If there's a tenant that's farming the land, how does the incentive then go, or the reward, how does it go to the tenant? It'll end up going to the farmer, the owner of the land. And what is the guarantee that the owner of the land would actually share that with the tenant? So that's another problem out there. And there's a lot of tenancy in Punjab at the moment. There might be another problem, right? That the idea that this cash incentive is there might itself affect tenancy arrangement itself, and we don't understand what that is. The other thing to think about, especially when thinking about the scheme beyond Punjab, is that it may not work in places where there are lots of informal groundwater markets. And that's what happened with the Fishman study in Gujarat. Northern Gujarat, where Ram and others implemented that study, there's a very extensive and vibrant informal groundwater market where essentially farmers who own pumps sell irrigation water to those who don't own pumps. And so when the similar cash incentive scheme was implemented, it actually didn't create any reductions in pumping behavior. There's a fear that if such a scheme were to be introduced in areas where there are groundwater markets, it might change the price at which irrigation services are offered to marginal farmers. It might change access to irrigation water of marginal farmers. We don't understand what the distributional consequences of this would be. And finally, even for the case of Punjab, where groundwater abstraction is extensive, is this even enough to quote unquote reverse the problem, right? And that's not clear at all, because ultimately the problem is being driven by the production of wheat and rice, and it's reasonable to say that no significant progress on slowing down groundwater withdrawal is necessarily going to be achieved as long as wheat and rice are continue to be cultivated. And so if this were to be implemented at scale, it's not clear whether what it gets us in the net necessarily justifies the costs of implementing this type of scheme, which is not trivial. So again, just being a bit cautious about scaling this up. I'm now going to talk about a next study, which is really a contrast to this, which is about expanding irrigation in Ethiopia. And this is again part of a paper. This is again coming from a paper that came out last year, where we look at what is it? Is it price, the unavailability of credit, or is it really ambiguity, which is restricting the adoption of small-scale irrigation in Ethiopia? And if you look at most irrigation expansion policies globally, right? I mean, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa at the moment, it typically focuses on subsidizing private inputs. And the government is keen to increase small-scale irrigation, especially associated with groundwater. And policy efforts have been made to lower pump prices. So this has been done by eliminating import taxes, sales taxes on pumps and irrigation equipment, and yet adoption is pretty low. Now, what we argue in this paper is that groundwater irrigation is multi-stage, by which I mean that you are less likely to purchase a pump and install it if you don't know where to drill a borehole in the first place. And that is a known problem. There is a lot of ambiguity around hydrology in sub-Saharan Africa, including in Ethiopia. And a consequence of that is borehole failure is actually pretty high. Including in this particular study, almost everybody who had a borehole had been successful at hitting water on their second attempt. And it's extremely expensive drilling a borehole in Ethiopia, and as it is in other countries in Africa. And so the idea being that if you don't know where to install and what to do, why would you purchase the input itself? So we do a choice experiment in the field to simply understand the willingness to adopt irrigation packages. And we look at and we sort of experimentally vary the price of the pump, the way credit for the pump might be available, and how ambiguity might be reduced. And so what we find is that the reduction in ambiguities around drilling boreholes, reducing the rate of borehole failure really, and the provision of loan products really has the greatest effect on the willingness to adopt irrigation packages. Tax breaks on pumps are actually the least effective. In fact, a 15% tax break, which basically reduces the pump by 15. I mean, it's a 15% reduction in the price of the pump by removing the tax, actually produces really has no effect on the willingness to pay. And even for a much larger sort of reduction, it's just about 4%. So it's actually very small. So essentially, this goes back to the larger question of private adoption of inputs is, and we know this from other studies, is related towards, is higher when uncertainties and ambiguities in the system are just lower. And so reducing ambiguities is going to be vital for expanding small-scale irrigation, especially if you're expecting farmers to make private investments as well. And so I think a lot of you know this better than I do. There's a huge emphasis on expanding small-scale irrigation in sub-Saharan Africa. It's driven by issues of food security concerns. It's driven by the fact that agriculture has predominantly been rain-fed and is still rain-fed in sub-Saharan Africa. But that has always been risky, and is going to get riskier with the vagaries of precipitation that are being brought over because of climate change. Large-scale irrigation of the type that we've seen in South Asia, which is these big community command schemes, have low favor for a number of issues. Part of those issues are agroclimatic, some of them are political. Small-scale irrigation is agreed. I mean, policymakers agree that that's where the focus of the action is, in part because they have lower costs. It doesn't require collective action, requires low maintenance, etc. And of course, some studies that have been done by hydrologists, hydrogeologists suggest that there is quite a bit of potential for irrigation with groundwater. But the challenge is that the resolution at which these studies have been done is not fine enough to understand where to drill locally, so that you might be able to extract water for a significant number of months in the year. And so the hydrology, the granularity of that hydrology needs to be improved. Ethiopia has been very consistent in its policy to expand smallholder irrigation. So the supply of pumps, repair and maintenance has improved. However, only about less than 7% of households irrigate, and less than 9% of irrigating households use groundwater. There are a number of demand-side bottlenecks which are focused on the price of the pump. That's sort of been eased by removing the import tax, which lowers the price of the pump by about 30%. Lack of credit has been acknowledged. Microcredit is often not large enough to cover the costs of this pump, and the payback period of microcredit is too short. These pumps require a longer payback period, but little effort has been made on that front. And of course, there are other challenges, right? You have highly fragmented land holdings, there's soil degradation, there's pestilence. And again, all of these create uncertainties in smallholder systems, depressing the adoption of technologies. And, some scholars have argued that this is sort of what might be called a low equilibrium trap. It's a stable equilibrium trap, but you're caught in a low equilibrium, and it's very hard to break out of it unless consistent effort is made across a bunch of things at the same time, which is easier said than done, of course. We look at the aspect of uncertainty and adoption because the ambiguities around borehole drilling have not received as much attention in policy as they perhaps should have. As I said, the hydrology is coarse. It's not fine enough to really understand where to drill successfully and then reduce borehole failure. How deep to drill, the seasonality of water is not known, and drilling is extremely expensive. It can cost up to, for example, in certain parts of Kenya, it could cost up to even $10,000 to drill a borehole. So it's not trivial. And so we really think about irrigation in this context as a multi-stage technology adoption, where there's fiscal support at different phases can affect adoption. Uncertainties in one stage can affect adoption later on. And of course, heterogeneity, because it looks like this hydrology is fairly heterogeneous, even within small areas where we know a little more about the groundwater hydrology. And so that kind of heterogeneity just makes it very hard to learn from others. And so all the more there is a requirement for public investments here to reduce these information asymmetries and in doing so, reduce uncertainties as well. So we look at how subsidies on price pumps, loan availability, and the reduction in ambiguities related to borehole drilling influence farmers' willingness to adopt irrigation packages. And since irrigation is so low at baseline, we really can't study behaviors as they already are. And we, of course, didn't have the budget to do an actual experiment where we subsidize pumps and give it to people. So we look at a discrete choice experiment, and we look at stated preferences. And so this is, we did the study we look at 400 households in 16 villages that are in Dera and Amhara and Lemo in SNNPR. We purposely selected these areas because we know that there is high groundwater potential and there is access to shallow groundwater. And this is important because where ambiguities, because we're actually looking at an area where ambiguities around borehole drilling are perhaps less than they might be in other parts of Ethiopia. And even here we find that even though these ambiguities are relatively lower than other areas, they're still large enough that, you know, people tell you that that's really the biggest challenge that they would want, you know, a solution for. And so we selected sub-districts, villages. We randomly selected households in a village, and so the sample is adequately sort of powered to do the analysis that we do. So we were careful to pay attention to study design out here. So if we look at what the sample looks like, pump ownership is, you know, 25% of sample households were irrigating at least one plot. So this is not surprising because we deliberately chose an area where we know a little more is known about groundwater, so irrigation is likely to be higher than it is across Ethiopia. 35% of households had drilled a well or had been involved in drilling a well previously. Almost everybody who had drilled a well essentially struck water successfully on the second attempt. And that's important because the first attempt would just be a sunk cost. And 15% of households had taken loans in the last 5 years for agricultural inputs or livestock. And so this is what the choice experiment looks like. We essentially vary the type of pump, we vary the tax break on the pump, we vary whether there's access to a loan or not. And when we look at, you know, whether you have a loan or not, what we look at the characteristics of the loan that are essentially drawing from what livestock loan looks like in sub-Saharan Africa, in Ethiopia, which is really, you know, a loan is offered for up to 20,000 birr. It's an installment for 3 years at 20% interest, so it's fairly high. This is the loan that's available out there. People know about it, so we use the same features, you know, as what's existing there. And of course, the asset itself is the collateral. So these livestock loans in Ethiopia do not require any other form of collateral. And then we looked at well drilling, where we said, you know, there were two sort of, so there are kind of two levels to the well drilling characteristic. Either the farmer drills the well, which means the farmer bears all the costs regardless of water being, you know, striking water or not. And so there are ambiguity, so it's ambiguous. And, you know, nobody really knows what the probability is of, you know, what success rate would be. Or it's the government drill the well, which is where the farmer bore the cost of drilling the entire borehole only when water was successfully reached. So if there was a failure, the farmer did not have to bear the cost of that. But when water is successfully reached and the well is successfully installed, the farmer has to bear the full cost of the borehole, whatever that is. So that's how we sort of introduce the notion of ambiguity there. And then we, of course, because this is a choice experiment, we had to look at the study design. There are sort of 36 unique options. There are 630 pairwise choice sets. So we essentially, you know, had to construct an experiment, you know, using sort of a DE efficiency measure to make sure that, you know, we bring in an adequate number of choice sets per farmer that basically allow us to be able to test the hypothesis in question without overburdening the farmer. And so we wanted to minimize respondent fatigue. So we don't look at interaction effects between the different attributes, you know, which is a limitation of the study. There is no opt-out option in this choice experiment. So what that means is the farmer cannot say, I don't choose any of these choices. So we are forcing them to make a choice. As a result of which, you know, this study should not be used in order to estimate demand. So it's really the willingness to pay or it's the willingness to adopt, not the willingness to pay. So that's the caveat in the study. And we do a whole bunch of robustness checks to understand whether farmers understand how to make choices, by presenting a choice that's strictly dominant and seeing whether they choose it or not. We look at whether we randomize the order of appearance of cards. The position of the options of the card is changed and randomized. So there's a whole bunch of things that we do in order to, which are kind of best practices when designing these kinds of choice experiments. And of course, we look at, whether the design satisfies conditions of orthogonality, balance, overlap between attribute levels, all that kind of stuff. And so if you look at the average duration of choice, right? So because each farmer has to basically, they're presented 6 pairwise choice sets. And so if you look at it, the time that's taken to make these choice sort of goes down, which is what you would expect to see in something like this. And so this is an example of what a card looks like, so we would ask farmer, we would present these 2 cards to them, for example. We would say, this is a pump, this is, there's a no discount break, you get a loan, the roll is, the well is drilled by the government, which means you only pay when it's successfully installed. You don't do anything if it fails. As opposed to, the pump here is a motor pump, you get a discount break, you don't get a loan, and you have to drill the borehole yourself. And so which one would you choose, etc. So we look at the effect of these 4 attributes: pump type, tax break discount, loan access, and well drilling on sort of this irrigation sort of package choices. We use a standard conditional logit estimator, and the limitations, of course, are that, all the coefficients are fixed for all decision makers, and the identification relies on an independence of irrelevant alternatives assumption. Then we also do a random parameters logit estimator, which somewhat relaxes the assumptions. And we report the, the results, the marginal effects of the attributes. And we also look at a little bit at the heterogeneity, that we see, and we look at, and we'll go a little bit into that. So the limitations and caveats are, of course, it's a simple experiment. There's no opt-out option. As I said, this is not willingness to pay. This is willingness to adopt, which is an entirely different story. You cannot use it to assess sensitivity to prices of pumps or different rates of interest on loans, or the amount of support to reduce ambiguity. So you really cannot assess demand elasticities. It's a choice experiment, so it comes with all the limitations of stated preference methods. Income doesn't play a role in the study either. So it's really a first step towards understanding what farmers are most sensitive to. And as I said, we really were not able to use revealed preferences. Actually, we collected this data in the middle of the pandemic, oddly enough. So that was an exercise in and of itself. And we can talk about that too, if you want. So what we find are loans are really the most important attribute affecting irrigation choices. Government drilling is sort of the second most important thing. Prices are significantly less important attributes, even with a 30% subsidy. The effect of prices in the choice of irrigation packages is actually very limited. And this makes sense. I mean, why would you, even if a pump is subsidized, why would you buy it if you don't know where to drill a borehole? So it completely makes sense in that context of things. So the standard deviation of the coefficient is non-significant for price attributes, which means there's limited variation of preferences among respondents. But there is a heterogeneous preference for other attributes. So essentially, so what that really means is price does not seem to be important no matter what kind of farmer you are. But the other types of attributes, which is the pump, who drills the well, etc., that seems to vary depending upon your own attributes. That's what you want to take away from this. And so if you look at the marginal effects of choosing irrigation packages, having a high subsidy on the pump just, increases the probability of choosing an irrigation package by 4%, while the really big effects are coming off, having access to a loan that has a longer payment period and where you don't have to make a collateral, and along with just the reduction in ambiguities in borehole drilling. And so finally, we just look at a little bit of heterogeneity here to see, as I said, there seems to be no heterogeneity in preferences when it comes to looking at the price attribute. But when you look at these other attributes, it's clear that different people value different things. So farmers with experience drilling boreholes and those who are already irrigating have a much greater preference for solar pumps because, you don't have to pay for the fuel for it. Preferences for loans and governments really drilling the wells increases with greater market access. So the more strategically placed you are, you think you want to increase your potential to irrigate so that you can actually earn more income. And if you have an experience drilling a borehole and installing wells, having at least one irrigated plot, time to travel markets, you all the more want governments to come in there and help you with drilling the boreholes. So what are we finding? That even in areas with high groundwater potential, pump ownership is low, and providing access to loans and reducing the uncertainties is perhaps going to have a greater effect in the willingness to adopt irrigation than simply subsidizing the pumps. And this access to loans and the reductions in uncertainty is valued even more with farmers who have better access to markets. So essentially, there's a huge role for the government in reducing uncertainties. So it's really about funding hydrogeology, training and certifying well drillers so that they don't use a hit or miss strategy to drill boreholes. There may be some role for risk transfer, so for example, it may make sense for the government to say, they're willing, because there's uncertainty in this, they are willing to somewhat offset the risks of well drillers so that they can work with the governments to basically develop better hydrological maps. And of course, as we all know, there is a huge role for the Development Bank of Ethiopia to design irrigation loan packages, possibly by adapting, the livestock loan products themselves. So this is really an example of where policy has focused on subsidizing some part, of this irrigation value chain, where perhaps you might actually have better action by focusing elsewhere. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to open up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much. We had said originally that we would do some questions and then go to just the group of mentors and mentees, but I think with our numbers at the moment, we're fine just to keep everybody participating who wants to participate. So we've got one question in the Q&A. I would encourage other people to write them, and I would suggest that we start with questions really about the seminar and about the issues that she's presenting. And then if there's other kinds of questions, maybe more about the work and why this kind of work, or some of those other broader kinds of questions that fit into the mentoring mentee kind of program, we can move on to those. But let me start with the first one. And I think, SAoumya, you can see them too. So I'm going to read this one so everybody hears it. But we have, the first question is that in Nigeria, the environment is characterized by soil erosion, high population pressure, and increasing congestions in urban centers, which are further compounded by unplanned growth and increasing problems of domestic industrial waste disposal and pollution. How can we use the carrots instead of the stick approach to solve these kinds of challenges, thinking about the context of environmental and development economics?
It's a great question. So I think a number of problems that you're sort of mentioning out here are not trivial problems that just the market can solve on its own, to be very honest with you, right? So think about soil erosion. One of the biggest problems in the adoption of land management practices is that it's actually quite laborious for households to adopt them. I know, Cheryl, you've done some of this work in the past as well, looking at land adoption practices and who does it and what is the role of gender, etc. But one of the things that we see is that many of these practices are quite labor intensive. They take time. And especially if land holdings are highly fragmented, then the labor costs or the time cost to the household of doing this is actually quite hard. And in an environment where anyway agriculture is getting riskier, and we see a lot of seasonality in engagement in agriculture as well as in what people produce, engaging in these practices, simply because people are being incentivized to do it may actually not be sufficient, or may not even be the best way to go about implementing this stuff, to be honest with you. I think there's a huge role for coordinated government action out here, because a number of these, problems can only be solved when action is consistently taken across space and time. So, you know, if I'm a farmer and I maintain my land well, I am actually not going to necessarily benefit unless everyone around me also does it too. So you have this, so there's a bit of a collective action problem. There's a bit of sort of a, you know, so there are a number of reasons why just relying on or trying to incentivize people in this particular context may not necessarily be the most cost-effective way to do it. So that's one big sort of thought right out there. The other thing is, you know, you can think of carrots, but carrots are really implemented well when they're also sticks, to be very honest with you. I don't think these are necessarily mutually exclusive. And in fact, what we're learning globally is it actually takes many approaches to solve even just one problem. Like take, for example, you know, the introduction of drip irrigation, right, which is happening in some places in India. The government is really keen about this because they just want to increase irrigation efficiency. The problem is it's not, precision irrigation doesn't work unless the government also makes sure that people don't expand cultivated land, that people don't change crop type. All of that can't be done by carrots. That has to be done by sticks. So you can have a carrot in place, but you also have to have these sticks in place. So I don't think it's just one or the other. I think you have to think very cleverly about what are the number of things that's going to take and what is the capacity of a state to even implement all of this stuff, right? Because things might look very nice on paper, but if your ability to monitor it and keep a watch on it is not there, then it may actually create all other kinds of problems as well.
Great. Let me keep encouraging people to put questions in the Q&A. But I want to push you a little bit on thinking about this notion of failure, because you talked about it a bit. If we think about it in the context of the failure of projects, right, or of interventions, I'm going to come back to other ways of thinking about failure in a minute if nobody else has other questions. But if we think about projects and that they fail, how do we go about knowing why it is that they fail, right? And is it just that it's a really bad idea? We've all seen interventions where we think, well, of course that failed. Who would have thought of that one, right? Just a bad idea. It could be that it's just implemented badly. It could be that it's the wrong context, right? And so in thinking about learning from failure, how do you figure out what's gone wrong?
I think it's a great question, and I think it varies from context to context, right? So, for example, in the two cases that I presented in the Punjab case, there is success in a pilot scheme, but if you think about what does it mean if you were to put this up, you know, at the level of the entire state, it's not clear whether it would do the job. And the job here is I just want people to simply use less electricity and hopefully pump out less water. I mean, notice all we have here is really, we have data on electricity to the extent that we actually have data. When it comes to water, we are just relying on what people are telling us, which we hope is in some reasonable ballpark, but we have no way of really knowing that, right? And so if you think about this pilot scheme and we were to thinking it up to scaling it to all of Punjab, which has, you know, so many millions of farmers, I'm not sure this would really even necessarily produce those significant effects that people are looking for. And I think therein lies the problem. I think a lot of the ideas that we have, if we think about just theory and economics in general, these are all about changes at the margin. And we're trying to sort of have marginal changes lead to these big shifts, you know, discrete changes, right? I think that's the fundamental problem everywhere. So, you know, so something might work fine in a small setting, but the minute you start sort of scaling it up, A, you can't implement it that way for everybody in Punjab. And B, and so the consequence of that is that you may have some small changes in behavior, but they may not be significant enough to solve the problem in the first place. And I think that's something that I think we're struggling with in general when it comes to this nexus of problems of the environment. So be it sort of how do you improve, you know, how do you use resources less intensively and yet still keep sort of maintaining, pace on poverty alleviation, et cetera, particularly in low-income countries. Or think about, climate change and how do you reduce carbon even though you want to continue to grow. See, all the things that we have are just producing marginal changes, but we want these big discrete changes there. And so that, to me, that's the reason why I study these marginal changes, because people get excited about it, but then I come and say these are marginal changes, guys. Maybe you don't want to think about this for these discrete changes, and you want to be careful about it because it's not entirely clear whether this happen. Having said that, I will say that there is one place where I think this kind of marginal behavior analysis, I think, does have helpful insights. And I think that's for distributional issues. And I think, so if we were to think about things like inequality or inequity, and we think about what might we do, in policy and programming that somewhat shifts this around, I actually think there's some promise there. So for example, some of the work that we did in Tajikistan, which I know you're familiar with, right? Where we find that, these sort of management systems for water do increase, on average, increase access to water, but the distribution is not the same. And that's got to do with issues of gender and how do you change the way you implement this countrywide program so that you might be able to improve access to these resources to farms that are now being run by women because of just the migration story there. And so I think, and that's been done, and USAID has done follow-up studies to actually show that indeed that has stuck. So I think it's when you're trying to get these big systemic shifts that these marginal, which is what's happening in these, at least in the Punjab example, they're trying to get this big systemic shift in place, right? Yeah. so and I think we're seeing quite a bit of that. So I think the problem really does matter at the end of the day. Yeah.
So even the successes could be failures at a bigger scale. At
a bigger scale, and I think that's kind of that's the cautionary tale that we told in the Punjab story. It was funny, the reviewers were coming back kind of saying, oh, but this is great, you really should have more confidence in your results. We're like, no, it's not that we're not confident in our results. We just don't think this is the magic bullet everyone's looking for at that scale, right? I mean, so that's what I mean by say, you might have success in a small sense, but that might not necessarily sort of scale up at that other scale. Yeah.
Great. So the next question we've got is, were you able to look at how to reduce the ambiguity in the decision to have access to an irrigation system? Could pressure groups, maybe from farmer associations, help? Or does it all lie with the government, with what the government does or not?
I mean, it's a great question. So I think certainly when it comes to the adoption of other inputs in Ethiopia, at least, farmer associations, cooperatives, etc., certainly have a role to play out there. They often sort of come together and negotiate for purchasing inputs at a discounted price, which they can then sort of share with their members, etc. That also helps to reduce some of these information asymmetries. But in this particular case, the challenge is that because the hydrology is unknown and understanding hydrology is not a trivial task, and it's a fairly technical task, the state is going to have to come in here. And if we look at the history of irrigation in general globally, India, like South Asia, is often hailed as this huge example where farmers take so much of initiative to irrigate. Yeah, they're taking it because there were so many investments that were first made by the state, including in hydrology. I think that's the thing that we often fail to see. So because the governments made that first move to put in extension, put in hydrology, teach farmers how to drill boreholes, create local businesses that could come and drill your boreholes, with some technology in mind and some technique in mind rather than a bit of a, okay, let's see what happens approach is really why it took off. And so I think this is an example where you need those initial investments by the state so that then private actors, private sector, etc., find it profitable to come in and develop businesses around it. It's not going to happen unless the state puts in that information because it's expensive and it's an externality and it's a public good, really. That's what it is, right?
So to what extent are those lessons from India being implemented in Africa? Do you have a sense?
Not a lot. So I think, and again, I think I want to be careful. Again, it's not the successes, it's really the failures, right? That's what we want to think about, right? So if the intention is to expand irrigation rapidly, the state will have to play a role. I think there has been the private sector and activity around the private sector is really what's looked at as the way to sort of kickstart irrigation or other agricultural, the green revolution for Africa is sort of being looked at as something that the private sector will bring in, and I think the thing to learn from, I think, the Indian context very well might be that as you develop irrigation, how do you avoid or how do you sort of put a floor on some of the mistakes that have happened in South Asia, right? So for example, it's the other side of the problem in South Asia. There's incessant drilling of everything. Like anybody does everything that they want, and we have this huge problem of how do we manage our resources, and they're not. I mean, forget sustainability in the future. It's not even clear, the farmer who's irrigating today, would you have access to your groundwater 20 years down the line? That's what it's coming to in some parts of India. So it's problematic. So what might be done differently? So for example, there's work that's being done by some of these brilliant young entrepreneurs in East Africa, particularly. And what they're saying is that the smallholder agricultural system is fundamentally different. It is for a number of reasons than it might be, say, in South Asia or anywhere else. And perhaps we should be thinking about irrigation as a service rather than trying to sell pumps to everybody. So the idea is somebody comes and irrigates your land, and that may be something that a lot of smallholders find to be feasible and viable because it does two things. One, you don't have to buy the expensive pump. If you do buy it, the payout period is extremely long. Farmers don't necessarily cultivate every season. Theft of pumps, etc., is fairly high. Maintenance is a challenge. And because land holdings are fragmented, you can only irrigate one little bit, and you may have other bits that you can't really, you can't move the pump around, and you have to have all of this stuff, right? So what is the scope for irrigation as a service? And we certainly am aware of these brilliant entrepreneurs who are providing these kinds of services, to 3,000 farmers, 4,000 farmers in Kenya, in Uganda, etc. And so I think one of the interesting things out there is that if irrigation, if there was a policy to also look at the feasibility of irrigation as a service, if we're going to encourage that, what might we do there in order to avoid the mistakes of South Asia? So because it's much easier to work with companies that might be providing this service to 1,000 farmers than if all those 1,000 farmers were drilling their own boreholes. So I think the model may be different, and I think there may be different things to think about here.
Great. So the next question is, do you think that giving more carrots in the form of minimum support prices for more crops besides wheat and rice, just to diversify in Punjab, will help?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge issue, right? I mean, people have been talking about why don't we introduce MSP for millets, etc. The problem is you also have to have changes in diet, which is far from trivial. And there is no easy answer out there. And so until it becomes profitable for farmers to cultivate millet and quote unquote profitable enough for a government to offer a minimum support price for farmers to purchase that millet, I don't know whether that's necessarily the answer, to be honest with you. It's just more than a question of just offering a support price. Where does all that millet go if it was produced at that scale, right?
Right.
And I don't have an answer for that. We know that people change habits it's hard to change habits. We know that. So I don't know. I know a lot of people keep asking me that question. I'm not so sure whether that's a strategy that can be changed through policy. That's all.
And yet at times people do change their diets fairly quickly, right? And so it's really interesting as to when that happens and when it doesn't. Okay.
I think it's just a hard one to achieve at scale through policy. Maybe people might do it on their own for reasons, for health or other reasons. But, doing it through policy is very hard. So, yeah.
Good. Okay. So the next question is that in the case of India, how did you fix the incentive amount? And also how did you fix the amount of electricity as the cutoff? It says reduced irrigation is more of farmer behavior. There comes the opportunity cost.
Yeah, so I think the utility essentially made that decision. They basically offered an incentive, which is a bit lower than what it actually costs the electricity if that unit of electricity was used. So the farmer benefits because they get something, and the utility benefits because their loss is lower. So essentially, I think it costs something like, if the farmer used a unit, it costs something like 7 rupees per unit to supply that unit to that farmer if they consume it, actually. And they were offering 4 rupees for the unit to buy it back. So it's kind of, they're reducing the losses by 3 rupees a unit. That's kind of what they're doing. They fixed the entitlement of electricity. That was a hard one to do, right? Because historically there have been no meters on farmers. So even for those who agreed to enroll into the cash incentive and get metered, they didn't have a meter before that for the utility to know what their historical use has been. So they had to look at the electricity consumption data at the utility level, look at and they have information on what the horsepower of all these pumps on a feeder looks like. And they did some calculation there to sort of say, this is what maybe average consumption looks like. And then they increased it by, 1.25% or by 25% or something like that. So in order to kind of make sure that the allocation was sufficient enough. But also remember, in this particular case, if you exceed the allocation, no biggie, like nobody's going to come after you, or penalize you so it's kind of like you can continue to have bad behaviors, but if you have good behaviors, you get rewarded for it. So, which is what they did. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Then the next question is kind of thinking about this nexus between poverty and the environment, right? And the person asks, poverty can generate a misuse of resources due to immediate survival needs, which promote emphasis upon exploitation and excessive consumption of the local resource base that in the longer term only serves to build external dependencies. So how do we think about this kind of trade-off and putting in place policies that will help poor farmers use the resources well?
Yeah, I think I would actually push a little back on that statement and be a little careful. If you think about, so the case of Punjab is different. These are not, they may not be rich farmers, but they're not poor farmers. So some of the richest people in India are farmers in Punjab. Let me also put it out there. So I'd be a little careful about extrapolating from the Punjab case, because there has been so much government subsidy and support for the Green Revolution in Punjab. It's a different case there entirely. I think we want to be careful though about that statement on poverty. You see, the problem is, if you look at really poor households, each one of them independently actually is probably underutilizing resources. They're not eating as much as they should be eating to avoid malnutrition. They're not using as much of energy as they perhaps should be, in order to even increase productivity, etc. The problem is of scale. You just have a really large poor population. So to my mind, it becomes extremely hard to think about regulating the behaviors. It's the ethics of it. I find it very hard to think about regulating the ethics or regulating the behavior of individuals when each one of them is on their own, not necessarily causing the problem. You just have a lot of people. And so there, the solution to me really is about just making good investments in infrastructure, hospitals, education, etc. How do we sort of move this equilibrium along? potentially getting people out of agriculture, but these are not easy solutions. I mean, I think, it requires, the only country I can think of that has systematically done this, is probably China in the last 40 years. And if you look at the Chinese example, it's really been about massive investments in basic infrastructure and roads and education, quality services, to really just get people out of that economy. But again, remember, you run into a different set of problems. You might go from sort of over exploitation of local resources towards bigger problems such as air pollution and carbon. And so in a sense, you're trading problems. You're solving one set of problems for another set of problems, really. I mean, to be honest with you. Yeah.
Good. So we've got a couple more questions left. Trying to think of if I can put them together in any kind of way. They're all kind of asking you to solve big problems, and so the first one is give us the answers, Soumya. But what's the recommendation for farmers in remote areas that are not connected to groups or don't have linkages with approaches that can help them sustain their productivity? What do we do about farmers in these really remote areas?
It depends on what the policy initiative is. Again, it's not for me to kind of take a stand on what should or should not happen. If the intention is to, of course, is to make sure that, is the intention to really address poverty issues, or is the intention to put in safety nets so that people are no worse off than they already are? Those are not always the same thing. So I think it really depends upon what the policy goal here is, right? So it's really hard to answer the question without sort of having to understand what that is. Yeah.
Right. And I think a lot of these, it's really what's the solution in a particular context. It's hard to answer it generally.
Yeah.
So I guess the last two questions that I've got at the moment are both trying to think about these kind of solutions. So one is kind of, just one person is arguing and saying that farmers still depend on rain-fed agriculture. This is much more true in Africa than in India, but that there's such a high competition for groundwater. And so what's the role of irrigation in the future? And related to that is a question asking about other kinds of ways of accessing water, rain harvesting, building cisterns. She notes that in northeastern Brazil, there's experiences reducing vulnerability and clientelism with the government with these kinds of programs. So kind of
very big questions. I know. So let me get to the rainwater harvesting. And certainly in India, there have been communities, for example, that have revived or helped the recharge of groundwater systems through capturing rainwater in these sort of step well, it's a series of step wells while one flows to the other, and it helps with groundwater recharge. So certainly there is certainly scope for all of that type of action, including with the state supporting that kind of action. So that's not to say that there isn't a role out there. But given the scale of just the problem, and I think given just the fact that at least, and it depends again on where you are, so at least in the Indian context, given the fact that you have 1.3 billion people and there's all kinds of things happening, you can't really avoid the role of the state here. Because you need that. And again, states, unfortunately, governments, unfortunately, may have other agendas. I mean, and we're seeing that, globally, unfortunately. So, but the fact of the matter is that, if you want to have that kind of systematic action and management of resources where you have allocations by sector, but really it's sort of so in a sense, what experts have really talked about is to say, look, you really need some kind of a planning here where, we understand where water goes for what activity, but how it gets used and the manner in which it gets distributed and used is a ground up thing. So you have to have these bottom up approaches nested under some sort of top down structure. And I think, and a number of people have talked about that, which seems to be a not unreasonable way of thinking about it, right? And I think it's really thinking about it. So it really requires sort of a vision and big picture sort of perspective on things. Yeah. And then answer the other question. I mean, this is a great question. And actually, some of the major people who fund irrigation activities, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, are thinking about this. Should we even be putting our money in irrigation? And I will contend and say that I think one of the things that's been missing from this larger conversation is the role of irrigation as a social safety net. So in that context, I do think it has some significant benefits to be had. They're not directly quantifiable. They may not be directly measurable because, again, we most of the times cannot measure the things we want to measure. That's the whole problem. But we have done some work, especially in Niger, where we look at the role of irrigation, including for farmers who are not able to sell their commodities to a wholesale market and are selling more locally to friends and neighbors. And we actually find significant food security, nutrition impacts there. So I would be, so again, I mean, so I think there is definitely a role to play as a safety net. Having said that, part of it is also thinking about how do you make rain-fed agriculture sort of less risky, and I think that's just getting harder to do in part because I think the problem itself that we're trying to solve is changing rapidly, right? And so there is certainly some role to be had out there as well. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a two-pronged strategy.
Great. Well, we are out of time. So let me just say thank you to SAoumya. It's been great to have you being our lead-off speaker in this series. And thank you to everybody who came today and asked questions and participated, and really hope that you'll join us again for the next in this series. So thank you to everybody.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, SAoumya. Thank you all.
Thank you. Great job moderating, Cheryl. Only you could have done it with such finesse. I think all I've done is to sort of say, we have some sense of how to define the problem. We're not so sure how to solve the problem. That's pretty much what I...
That's good, though. I always get nervous when I'm talking to people who know all the answers to everything, because we tend not to actually believe that they do.